We need on-site renewable energy, high efficiency, and all-electric homes everywhere in order to have a safe, just transition.
There are going to be incredible opportunities for workers in this new energy economy.
That environmental justice is also about communities being able to take charge of their own infrastructure.
If you've driven a newer model electric vehicle, you'll understand what the buzz is about. It looks like what you'd expect from a new car, but the experience of driving is somehow more intuitive. You'll notice that the car is quieter, it's more responsive to drive, it's more efficient, recovering energy while braking. After a month, you realize that you haven't stopped at a gas station and won't ever need to since you plug the car in at home every night. After a few months, you'll realize that you don't need an appointment for an oil change. Electric cars have fewer parts, require less maintenance, and the resulting convenience quickly becomes apparent. The major inconvenience, access to public fast charging, should quickly become a thing of the past with the level of federal financial support and private investment flowing to U.S. states. And every major automaker has publicly recognized the coming EV wave with major commitments and new models releasing as we speak. Ford alone is set to spend $50 billion by 2026 on EV production, with 2 battery factories under construction in Kentucky, 1 in Tennessee, and a recent announcement to build a $3.5 billion battery plant in Michigan with a Chinese partner. As simple as this sounds, from a consumer perspective though, the switch to electric vehicles presents significant policy and market development challenges. EVs represent just over 5% of passenger vehicles on U.S. roads, which is an amazing accomplishment for the industry over the last 5 years. With 7% of new vehicle registrations being EVs in January of 2023, the growth is continuing. However, increasing the percentage to 2/3 of new vehicles by 2032, as the EPA is planning for, faces real roadblocks. Before we discuss challenges, it might be best for me first to say that I think the goal of electrifying transportation is one that we must pursue. The climate benefit is clear, since as we decarbonize the electric grid, we decarbonize transportation with electric vehicles. This is not the case and cannot be possible with internal combustion engines. Possibly more important, though, is decoupling our economy and our lives from the corrupt oligarchy that rules the global petroleum market and reaps its financial benefits. I'll save us from listening to me talk about endless wars for oil and overthrowing governments and begging and bribing dictators to pump more oil. I'll just say that the electrification of transportation presents us with an opportunity to remake a fundamental aspect of modern life in a way that is more local, more socially advantageous, more transparent, more democratic, and more optimistic. To get there, we have a few hills to climb. A brief list includes labor issues. EVs have significantly fewer parts than internal combustion vehicles, require less maintenance, require different maintenance, and a leading EV company has a direct-to-consumer sales process that bypasses the traditional dealership model. This is not to mention that traditional automakers and dealers report that they are not yet making profits on EV sales. All of these characteristics pose workforce and employment issues that state governments, labor unions, business leaders, and training organizations must address. Supply chain issues. We face significant limitations when it comes to battery components and semiconductors. Not only are the majority of materials, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, etc., mined outside of the United States, but the majority of refining happens in China. 68% of nickel, 40% of copper, 59% of lithium, and 70% of the world's cobalt is all refined in China. This is an immediate challenge to the EV industry because to qualify for the 30% consumer tax credit established as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, batteries must contain 40% of critical minerals from North America. This requirement gradually increases to 100% by 2029. Public fast charging issues. Last year, researchers at the University of California at Berkeley tested every single fast charging station in the San Francisco Bay Area. They found that more than 1/4 of the 657 charging points didn't function during a 2-minute charging test. From payment systems not working, cable issues, screens not functioning, and network problems, the decentralized U.S. charging system is not only confusing, but not as reliable as a typical gas station. At the MREA, we installed one of the first DC fast chargers in the state of Wisconsin, and I can attest that having a functional charging station available 100% of the time for all the people that need it is a real challenge. The Bipartisan Infrastructure bill invests $5 billion in new charging infrastructure, and states have to conform to its rules, a requirement for 97% uptime and a single payment system. The implementation of this funding will be managed through different state approaches that work with a rapidly changing network of private development companies and incumbent electric utilities that have their own EV charging infrastructure plans. Meeting the access and reliability goals requires an effective funding and oversight process in each U.S. state. Which brings me maybe to the most significant challenge: legal issues. The oil industry, ethanol industry, and Republican-led states are already suing to block previous Biden-era auto pollution rules and are gearing up to fight electrification efforts in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. The level of public, political, and judicial opposition that will result remains to be seen. But if the past is prelude, it will present significant roadblocks to an efficient, uniform, rapid, and cost-effective transition to EVs. With this in mind, the biggest question might be, do we have the talent, vision, tenacity, and capacity to tackle these challenges and take full advantage of the opportunities presented by electric transportation? After talking with Jane McCurry from Clean Fuels Michigan, my answer quickly became, absolutely we do. I think you'll see what I mean.
Get in on the conversation with Jane during the Rise Up live events at the 2023 Energy Fair and charge your vehicle all at the same time. From June 23rd through the 25th, join us in Custer, Wisconsin for education, demonstration, and meaningful connection. Learn more and make your travel plans at theenergyfair.org.
We welcome Jane McCurry. She is the Executive Director of Clean Fuels Michigan. Jane, you also serve on the Michigan Governor's Council on Future Mobility and Electrification, and I know you from your work as a program manager of Renew Wisconsin, and we're really excited to talk to you today about electrifying transportation. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Good. Yeah, we're excited to have you. There's a lot of conversation around vehicle electrification, and I know you like to talk about it. So maybe we'll just start. Why don't you just tell us kind of about Clean Fuels Michigan and where your work is focused?
Yeah, that sounds great. I do love talking about this. I grew up in the Detroit area. My parents worked for Ford, so very much an automotive family. So I'm really excited to be working on this next frontier in the transportation industry. Clean Fuels Michigan is a nonprofit trade association. We are focused on advancing the clean fuel industries in Michigan, so that includes not only electric vehicles, but other cleaner fuels, propane, natural gas, hydrogen, and biofuels. And we're really focused on state-level policy actions to help push the industry forward. So we do a lot of legislator and state agency education, as well as working to bring the industry together and create a cohesive voice for the industry in Michigan.
Well, that's I didn't realize you grew up in an auto family, so good roots there. And talk a little bit, and I'm sure you can share quite a bit of information about how the auto companies are approaching this new opportunity and some of the challenges. But first, maybe let's just have a grounding question. Jane, tell me, why is an electric vehicle, maybe we'll stick with passenger vehicle because they're most accessible, why is an electric passenger vehicle better than your typical internal combustion vehicle?
For so many reasons. They're really high-tech vehicles. They tend to be very fun to drive. Electric motors are really responsive, so you get instant torque when you press on the accelerator. So they're speedy, they're quick, they're nimble, they're just fun vehicles to drive. But I know the audience here is probably most interested in some of the other benefits, like the fact that you can power your vehicle with renewable energy. If you have solar panels on your home, you can literally power your vehicle with the solar energy that your panels are creating, which is really great for the environment, obviously, but it also helps EV owners save on fuel and maintenance costs. So electricity to power your vehicle is much less expensive than going to the gas station to purchase gas for an internal combustion engine vehicle. And EVs have far fewer parts, so there's a lot less to maintain on them. For example, there's no oil to change. So some of that routine maintenance that you're used to in an internal combustion engine vehicle just doesn't exist in your EV. So not only are they fun to drive, but you save money on fuel and maintenance, and they're better for the environment.
Okay, that seems like a lot of benefits. So, I know this is a disruption to the industry, and I also know that many of the major auto manufacturers have really committed to an electric vehicle future. So you work in Michigan, the nation's kind of like auto manufacturing capital, or once was the capital, or maybe continues to be. What do you see happening? What's exciting? How are the auto companies and the state of Michigan kind of approaching this new opportunity?
Yeah, there's a lot happening, and I would argue that Michigan is still the home of the auto industry, although I think increasingly we're switching from talking about automotive to more mobility and transportation as a whole. So not just using passenger vehicles, but how do we have transit systems? How can we get around on bicycles and on foot safely? How do we think about air mobility and aviation in different ways to serve our society through package delivery or healthcare resources and things like that? So that's the approach that Michigan has been taking. Is, it's much bigger than just the big three automakers now. It's how do we get goods and services and people to the places that they need to be in an affordable and environmentally friendly way. And on that front, I think there's just a lot of really exciting things happening in the media and just in general in public in a way that hasn't happened in the past for electrification and electric vehicles. I don't know if other people have noticed this, but the only car ads I see in commercials now are for electric vehicles. And the number in the Super Bowl is just kind of a good benchmark to see how much automakers are continuing to pivot their advertising spend to those electric vehicle models that they have coming out because they know consumers are really excited about them. There are so many automakers that are spending billions and billions of dollars developing new electric vehicle models and that are committing to go all electric. GM has said publicly they're on a path to an all electric fleet by 2035. There are a bunch of other brands that are going all electric, like Cadillac and Lexus, Mercedes-Benz, Jaguar, Rolls-Royce. I mean, the number just continues to increase over time, and that's just in our legacy automakers. That's not talking about Rivian or Tesla or other exciting vehicles that are on the market now. So all that to say is a lot is happening, and it's really penetrating the general consumer now more than in years past when it was your early adopters, your kind of energy nerds like us that were interested in EVs.
So as you mentioned, consumers seem to be more and more excited about electric vehicles, and automakers are interested in building and promoting the adoption of electric vehicles, but surely there are challenges, and you work in the state of Michigan. I see you have some resources and policy recommendations for the state of Michigan, but maybe to start, what types of policies are you generally advocating for, or are you seeing at the state level that really help make electric vehicle electrification and transportation electrification a reality?
There are two main policy areas that we're focusing on right now. The first is on incentives to help broaden the market that has access to electric vehicles. You'll notice the automakers that I mentioned, like Mercedes-Benz and Rolls-Royce, Jaguar, they're luxury vehicles, and that's true across many vehicle makes and models right now. The ones that are electrified are the more expensive, the more luxury vehicles. And so we really need to be bringing the price of electric vehicles down. I think that's one of our number one challenges right now, is making sure that once we hit scale, that price parity is there, so that people who don't typically buy new vehicles, don't typically spend that much on a vehicle, do have access to vehicle electrification. So we're looking at incentives like EV rebates that are very focused on equity, very focused on how do we get middle income, everyday Michiganders access to purchase an electric vehicle. The second is looking at policies that can bring in many vehicle technologies to move the market forward and reduce emissions across the whole transportation ecosystem. And what we're looking at there is called a clean fuel standard. It's essentially a regulatory mechanism that sets a cap on how much emissions can come from a transportation fuel and then creates a credit mechanism so that fuels that are below that carbon intensity standard get rewarded for that, and the price of those fuels goes down for the consumer. So again, that's called a clean fuel standard. It's a really compelling policy to make sure that we're reducing emissions transportation sector wide and pushing more and more folks to all of the benefits that vehicle electrification offers.
You have a budget, a 23 budget recommendation for the state of Michigan to offer an additional incentive of $2,000 for low-income residents of Michigan to pursue an electric vehicle, kind of in line with your centering on equity and access. When it comes to clean fuel standard, are there states? What states are farthest along, and how has this worked in other places it's been adopted?
Yeah, there are a few states that have a clean fuel standard in place. California and Oregon have been operating their clean fuel standard for a number of years. British Columbia and Canada also has a clean fuel standard. Washington's will be up and running here soon. And then there are a number of other states that are pursuing this as a policy option, including Minnesota here in the Midwest. So it's one of those North Star policies that is big and bold, but can also have a really large impact both for emissions and for affordability of clean fuels. And the other thing that I love about it is, again, that it's transportation ecosystem wide. So EVs, being one of the lowest emitting transportation fuels, gain a lot of the credits, but it can also include sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. It can include renewable natural gas. So any fuel is a part of the standard, and so it really does help to achieve those economy-wide carbon reduction goals that many of us are working toward.
So I know you probably want to talk about more than just passenger vehicles, but I want to dig in a few more passenger vehicle topics here. One is, as you know, and as I see in some of the resources you've put out, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits for electric vehicles were extended. But there are some other provisions in that bill, including a domestic content standard for electric vehicles. So I wonder, how do you feel like this is going to impact the electric vehicle industry? And will we see, do you have a feeling that you're hearing that there will be kind of like supply chain issues, since many electric vehicles don't really comply to that domestic content standard in legislation at this point?
Well, there already are supply chain issues. And I think everyone recognizes that, from how do we get enough semiconductor chips to support all of our clean energy technology production, to how do we just produce enough vehicles to meet the demand. Today, supply chain issues are clearly an issue. In particular, as we look to Michigan and think about workforce, 20% of Michiganders' employment is tied to the mobility industry in some way. So they either work for an automaker, they work for an auto supplier, or their job is in support of one of those industries, whether they're running the McDonald's or the dry cleaner to support people who work in the manufacturing facility in that community. So it has a really big impact on Michigan and across the Midwest, to make sure that we are manufacturing these vehicles and the parts domestically. So for the new federal tax credit for electric vehicles, there are requirements for domestic battery components as well as domestic manufacturing and assembly. And I think right now that's really confusing for consumers to know what vehicles are eligible for the credit. What does that mean for me? And I think that's okay. There are resources out there to help consumers parse through how much of this credit am I actually eligible for. And I think we're just going to be in this space where it's a little bit confusing for a little while. That said, I think it's important that we do continue to focus on building out those supply chains in the United States, in the Midwest, hopefully in Michigan and in Wisconsin.
One of the things that if people research electric vehicles, there's some I guess, differing information on the environmental friendliness, you might say, of electric vehicles, them being, particularly, not produced at scale. They're a little more intensive to produce and have more minerals requirements for them. And so there's information out there that maybe an internal combustion engine over the life of the vehicle is just as good, if not better, than an electric vehicle. What would you have to say about that?
EVs are absolutely better for the environment than internal combustion engine vehicles. It is true that if you take an internal combustion engine vehicle and an EV and you're just taking them straight off the lot, they both roll off the lot at the same time, it took more energy to create that electric vehicle than the internal combustion engine vehicle. And that's exactly because all of those minerals that are needed to create the battery takes a lot of energy to mine them, to get them to a point where they can store that much energy. It's energy intensive, and we're not doing it at scale yet. That said, the minute those vehicles roll off the lot, that clock starts running backwards. There are numerous studies that show that electric vehicles, pretty much no matter where you drive them, what the grid mix is in that area, are much better than driving an internal combustion engine vehicle. The average gas vehicle right now gets about 25 miles per gallon. If you look at Wisconsin, the average electric vehicle in kind of mile per gallon equivalent of emissions gets about 50 miles per gallon. That number goes up a little bit in Michigan, more like 55, 60. If you look at areas of the country that have a lot more renewable energy on the grid, that can look more like driving a 110 mile per gallon gas vehicle. So again, EVs, it's the only vehicle you can power solely by renewable energy, so those numbers will continue to look better and better over time. And electric vehicles are, from many, many studies, much better for the environment, again, because they can be powered by renewable energy, even though they're more energy intensive to manufacture over the life of the vehicle, much better. Fewer emissions, better for the environment, better for public health, because you're not breathing in all of those combusted particles.
Yeah, that makes a good partnership, right? Because the cleaner the electricity system, the cleaner the electric vehicle. And so I think we're, the motivations are aligned here. We need to clean up the electric system so we can clean up our emissions and embodied energy in electric vehicles. Maybe we'll switch now. We've talked a little bit about residential vehicles. Maybe we can talk about some of what you're saying in fleet or midsize or other transportation with electrification. What opportunities do you see there, and what do you see as successful or near future?
More and more, I feel like the conversation in advocacy circles is shifting toward the medium and heavy duty space. Fleets make really great use cases for electric vehicles in a lot of different ways. For example, we know exactly where fleet vehicles are. They oftentimes have fixed routes. They oftentimes come back to a depot overnight. So for example, let's think about a school bus fleet. They drive a set number of miles every day. They take a break in the middle of the day. They go back out. They're sitting idle overnight. That's a great use case for electrification because you can easily plan when those vehicles are going to charge. They have plenty of time to recharge overnight. And you're carting children around that are more susceptible to the negative health impacts of riding around in a diesel vehicle multiple times a day, or waiting at the bus stop at eye level with that tailpipe. So school buses are an excellent use case for electrification. In many cases, delivery vehicles can be great use cases as well. Amazon has purchased 100,000 electric delivery vans because, again, they're driving a fixed route, they're ending up at the depot again at night. It's just a great use case to plan for electrification. And again, reduce emissions in those urban areas where those vehicles are putting a lot of miles. It can have a really big impact on the community.
Clean Fuels Michigan posted some recommendations for supporting mid-size vehicle electrification. And a lot of it is planning, as you said, but also leveraging some of the incentives that are coming through new federal legislation. Is there anything particularly you'd like to discuss around, how you feel the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or Inflation Reduction Act presents opportunities for electrification for states?
Both of those federal bills present numerous opportunities for all kinds of electrification. Specifically on fleet electrification, we've shined a light there because there's been so much excitement around NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is going to be hugely impactful for putting charging infrastructure along interstate highways for passenger vehicles. But there hasn't been a ton of attention placed on how do we use these amazing resources and pots of funding for fleet electrification. And so we wanted to highlight that there's dozens of programs available to not only support passenger vehicle electrification, but to electrify fleets for all of the reasons that we've already talked about. One of those related to school buses is the EPA Clean School Bus Program. Many Midwest states were very successful in securing that funding to electrify dozens and dozens of school buses. That program will continue to run for the next 4 years. There's other programs that are flying maybe a little bit more under the radar that offer states funding on a formula basis. So every state is guaranteed to get a portion of the funding, and that can be used to plan for vehicle electrification, whether that's from the state fleet perspective or helping municipalities think through how do they electrify their fleet, whether it's their municipal utility fleet or their transit fleet, or to think kind of statewide about where do we need infrastructure to support these vehicles. And so taking a look at the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, the Carbon Reduction Program, and the Conservation Block Grant Program are all really important ways that the state can harness those pots of funding to help meet some of those state climate or transportation goals with a bend toward fleet electrification.
Yeah, I see that, in your recommendations for the state of Michigan really follow that. Buses, fleets, leverage the funding. I think it seems like a really good roadmap for states to look at when they think about electrification. One of the benefits with the clean energy transition that we talk about all the time is jobs. And when it comes to from electric vehicles, how much have you looked at that? I know that was a big issue between kind of the auto industry and their labor unions, is kind of how does the manufacturing look? Does it require less workers? So you want to talk about jobs and electrification? What do you see as the future benefits, challenges?
I think there are both a few benefits and a few challenges, and that's one of the reasons that I'm so bullish on Michigan maintaining our leadership on this is, again, because there are so many Michigan jobs that are tied to the auto industry. We need to make sure that we're capturing those opportunities to build electric vehicle batteries, to build semiconductor chips, because the reality is that electric vehicles have fewer parts than internal combustion engine vehicles, and so there simply will be, fewer jobs or a transition of jobs as we move more and more toward a zero carbon economy. There are dozens of opportunities to either recapture or retrain those jobs, though. As we think about the number of electricians that we'll need to install and maintain electric vehicle charging stations, as we think about the new parts, the new supply chain for both building and recycling electric vehicle batteries, there's still going to be plenty of jobs, and those are going to continue to grow. But planning around how do we help communities that, for example, have a mainstay employer right now that's building a transmission part that we know likely won't be a part of the vehicle future in the next however many years. I think some would maybe say 10 to 12, maybe we're looking more like 20 to 30, but making sure that we're doing that strategy up front, planning to help those communities bring in some new opportunities with this transition, I think is going to be very important, because industries change, and I think we're seeing that across many different industries right now, and it's what we saw when we switched from horse and buggy to vehicles too, right? The person who changed horseshoes had to find a new job, and we don't want to be cutthroat about that, but we do want to recognize that that is something that's going to be changing. And so Michigan's doing a lot of work to invest in how do we build the workforce of the future, how do we retrain people who will need training. Another example, auto mechanics. They're going to need to know how to work on electric vehicles. And they have amazing expertise that we don't want to let their businesses die. We want to make sure that they're a part of this transition. And so in both last year's state budget and I'm sure in this year's state budget, we'll see examples of how the state's investing in our tech colleges, in the University of Michigan and Michigan State University, to build out those portfolios of curriculum to both train the next workforce as well as retrain existing workforce.
To put some specifics out there from the Inflation Reduction Act, which really, it creates this opportunity, surely, that you're talking about, and also the challenge. That tax credit, it lists 50 critical minerals, and it says 40% minimum of those critical battery minerals would need to be produced domestically to qualify for the tax credit before 2024, and then it goes up to 50% of the value of the U.S. made batteries components come from North America, and then it rises to 60%, and then 70% in 2026, and then all the way to 100% in 2029. So it seems to me that this type of incentive and this landscape would kind of place the auto industry and all of its partners in new partnerships, right? So what do you see happening in the supply chain? Because we really don't produce many of these materials domestically. So I imagine there's a role for states and industry to envision what these supply chains look like.
It's a complicated puzzle to put together. I do know that the industry is really focusing on this, and there are so many announcements of new battery assembly and battery manufacturing facilities in the United States. It seems like every other day. Michigan won 4 big plants last year to help build the electric vehicle batteries of the future. I think even more complicated than building them is, like you said, how do we mine those critical minerals? How do we get those in the United States to service those manufacturing facilities? And it's tricky, right? Because then we have conservation issues that we need to deal with. Mining is really hard to do in a sustainable and an ethical way. But I think there's a lot of progress being made. There's a company in Michigan called One, Our Next Energy, or One is their name, and they are building some of the most powerful electric vehicle batteries on the market with fewer and fewer components to them and fewer of those critical minerals that human labor concerns around them. For example, cobalt, they're using less cobalt than ever. And so there's a lot of really exciting advancements that are happening. And back to the conversation around federal infrastructure funding, there's an exciting example, again, in the Midwest, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Michigan Tech is working with Eagle Mine. They were awarded a $74 million federal grant to help advance domestic battery recycling and reuse, to help get to how do we recapture the minerals in those batteries at the end of life so that we don't need to mine for those materials as often or as much. An Eagle Mine in the Upper Peninsula is actually the only nickel mine in the U.S. So again, getting to the fact that actually mining these minerals is really complicated and tricky. And so how do we harness and recycle as much of the material that's already out there as possible, I think is a really exciting advancement for the industry to continue to pursue.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's build off of this idea of innovation, because I know we'll need a lot of it, both to develop the critical mineral supply chain, make batteries that need less and produce more and last longer. But in general, when you see this kind of transportation electrification and clean fuels, what innovations are you saying that you think are really exciting out there, and that maybe will change how we think about transportation?
I am really excited to see how vehicle-to-grid integration plays out across the industry and across different use cases. So essentially, electric vehicles could operate like a mobile battery. Again, going back to our example of school buses sit idle for most of the summer when in the Midwest we're seeing our peak electricity use as air conditioners are running throughout the summer months. So is there an opportunity to harness that school bus's battery as a peak shaving technology, so that either for the school district or another community building or maybe the city, local manufacturing, you name it, utility resource, that battery could provide peak shaving and the school district could make a little bit of money by using their school bus in that way. There's numerous other examples of vehicle-to-grid or vehicle-to-building technology that with some really sophisticated monitoring, we could harness those electric vehicle batteries as grid resources to further reduce emissions, further bring down costs, and work with our utilities to do that. There's some interesting technology advancements that are needed, along with some regulatory clarity to really open up that market. But I'm really interested to see what use cases are going to harness vehicle-to-grid technology and how our utility companies embrace that as a grid resource going forward.
Yeah, that seems like a really a big opportunity with school buses. I know that Sunrun and Ford with the F-150 Lightning are out with their kind of like, this is going to happen, power your house with your Ford F-150. I think that the consumer access to that is very interesting and could really lead us to more and more of that in the residential space, but also just these opportunities in commercial seem really intriguing. What about in Michigan? I heard this news. Maybe this is something that you're following, this kind of like these innovations in charging. One is this wireless charging, basically a road that charges your car. You just have a thing on there. You pay like a service fee and you can just pull up downtown and charge your car while you go shopping. What are you seeing in charging? And maybe you want to talk about that innovation.
Yeah, charging is also coming a long way, not just in bidirectionality, but in speed and power. I mean, the amount of electricity we can put into a car battery really quickly now is kind of astounding. But also wireless charging is really exciting. And there's a few different use cases that wireless charging makes a lot of sense. Michigan is demonstrating wireless charging on an active roadway. So your vehicle can actually charge while you drive down the road, which is pretty incredible. There are also use cases for inductive charging where you're stopped. So again, thinking about public transit fleet, you have buses that operate all day. I have a member that has a technology that they work with those transit bus and other fleets that have really long duty cycles. So the vehicles are being used for quite a long time. So they're not returning to charge up like a school bus would in the middle of the day. Those inductive charging pads can be added to the bus stop. The bus pulls up, waits 2 minutes while passengers load and unload. It gets a little bit of a charge. It can top up. And then it extends the range of those vehicles by quite a lot, because every few minutes they're getting just a little bit of charge, a little bit of trickle charge through that in-road charging, inductive charging, wireless charging. And so that's a really interesting technology too that will allow electric vehicles to go further without having to return to the depot to do a long charging session.
What are you with me where you feel like we're at this point where 5 years from now, many people will be surprised how many options there are for charging? Are we about to experience a wave of kind of charging infrastructure build out, or am I being too optimistic?
We are about to experience that. And I think it's needed. I'm hearing and seeing that demand for vehicles is going through the roof. And the automakers are going to be ready with their supply chains and with their new makes and models in the next 3 years that the floodgates for vehicles are going to open. And if you want an EV, there will be one on the lot for you. We need the charging infrastructure to also be there to support all of those EV drivers with a really great customer experience so that they truly can get anywhere that they want to go with ease in an electric vehicle. The infrastructure has come a long way in the past few years, and over the next 3 to 5, it's really going to explode. And again, that's thanks to those federal infrastructure dollars in most part. The NEVI program is $7.5 billion for public electric vehicle charging across the country. That's going to go on interstates. It's going to go in communities. It's really going to put the backbone of infrastructure out there so that you have that fast charging when you're on a longer road trip, which is going to be really important for consumer confidence. I think you know this, Nick. The majority of EV drivers, for the majority of time, charge their car at home overnight. So if you have a garage, if you have an outlet in your garage, you can drive an EV really comfortably for the majority of the time. But that's not why we buy our vehicles, right? We buy our vehicles so that we can throw our kayaks on the top of it and drive up north in the summer times. And so you want to make sure you can get there comfortably in your EV, and that infrastructure will be there in the next few years, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's probably also necessary in some ways in the broader picture to reduce the environmental impact of EVs, because many families buy EVs now as a second car and still rely on their combustion engine to get them long distances because of lack of infrastructure. And so it's heartening to hear kind of from your inside view and just the description of the funding that's out there, how we might relieve this range anxiety question that's plagued electric vehicles from the beginning, and much of that is really related to available charging. So we've talked about fleets, we've talked about residential vehicles, we've talked about supply chains issues, talked about innovations. What about is there any work that you're doing on? I know that the larger vehicles, when it comes to carbon intensity, our passenger vehicles are really a minority of our energy use in transportation. So cracking that kind of like larger vehicle and public transportation piece is important. What are you seeing there? Do you have anything out there that you think we should be optimistic about, or what's the future with larger vehicles?
Well, battery technology has also come a long way. So more and more electric vehicles are an option for many larger vehicle use cases. I also think the conversation around hydrogen electric vehicles has come a long way over the past few years. Increasingly, what I'm seeing in industry is that it looks like in that long haul Class 8 trucking category, hydrogen is a really great solution to allow really quick refueling. Hydrogen can be a zero emission fuel, and it can provide the range that right now battery electric vehicles just aren't able to do for those heavy payload, long route trucking routes. And so I'm really excited to see how hydrogen continues to innovate. We need the costs to come down a little bit. We need the vehicles to be available, which again, they're coming. There's many, both battery electric and hydrogen semi-trucks coming to market and being tested across the country now. So it's a tricky use case where they drive a lot of miles. They're operating a lot of the time, often towing really heavy payloads. And I think that's a use case where hydrogen could play a really large role, and again, be zero emissions. So opening up what we think of as electrification and including hydrogen in that, I think will be really interesting over the next few years.
Well, great, Jane. It's all been really interesting. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about today or like to share that we didn't touch on?
Just that it's such an exciting time in this industry. I've been talking about EVs in the Midwest for almost 5 years now, and the scope and clarity of the conversation has changed substantially, and MREA has been a big leader in that, along with many of your and my partners across the Midwest. So it's really exciting. I'm happy to be a resource to anyone. cleanfuelsmichigan.org. We have tons of information available on our website, and my email's listed there too. So just really excited to be a part of the industry and continue to see all of the progress that's made over the next few years.
And now, a moment to thank one of our career fair sponsors, Panasonic. Panasonic believes that technology can play a fundamental role in making the world a better place. Their aim has always been to develop useful, high-quality products that have a positive impact on the world and enable their customers and employees to live their best lives. To learn more, visit na.panasonic.com.
The Rise Up Podcast, Season 4, Episode 4, Electric Vehicles. Special thanks to our guest, Jane McCurry, hosted by Nick Hyla and produced by Kyle Galloway. Made possible with support from the Sally Mead Hands Foundation.